Just to give you context, Australia is very similar in size to North America, just to give you an idea of the context. So, my talk is what species groups make up the regional flora, the observed presences and absences of the plant groups, and my proposed likelihood of where they derive from. None of this has been tested, this is just purely an observation. Okay, this is my study area, which is approximately about 6% of the entire continent. To give that an idea, when you think about the size of some states, that's a large area, and that's pretty much the area that I control between me and my technicians. That's it. Okay. The arid southern Northern Territory has approximately 2,300 species, which is quite large. To give you in context, the McDonnell Ranges, and you can see a lovely picture in the background there, one of our highest points, has 1,300 species. It's the second most botanically diverse area in the territory. The other is the more famous Kakadu, which has an extreme area of endemism. So here we are in the middle of the desert, something similar to what we're seeing around here, yet we have this high endemism. We also have a series of refugia, but at the same time, in the extreme, we also have the Simpson Desert having a large area, probably the size of, say, one of the smaller states like Maryland, having only 100 species, which is one of the smallest for the entire continent. And we probably have only one endemic species. It's currently undescribed, and it's all quite messy about where the hell it's going to stand when we finally work it out. It's quite a distinctive entity, but it's very closely related to another more widespread entity. All the other species there are really common and occur over nearly 1/3 to 2/3 of the continent. So really nothing exciting is happening in there, but that's another story for another day. These are some of the landforms that you will see. So the typical famous sand dunes in the Simpson Desert with these wonderful swales and crests, both having two separate types of flora on them. This is Gibber Plain. This thing here is quite a rare member in the Amaranthaceae. It actually looks like a boulder, so I spent half an hour to an hour looking for these two damn things, because even though it's in a plain of nothing, they actually just look like boulders and it's quite hard to find. So there are plants scattered in here, it just looks like nothing. Only after severe rain events would you ever find something. A salt lake, this is our only gypsum, and they live on the edges of these salt lakes, because as Mike Moore earlier said, it's quite soluble, so it disappears. Here is a local clay pan. Literally, my town was on the other side of this range with a cooler bar. It's during a period of quite wet, but right now it's as dry as all hell and you can drive on it. Also has a high clay and salt element, so unique set of species. And then we have the mountain ranges. One of the gorges here, one of the river lines, and just like the washes here, spend most of its time dry. And so when we have a flood event, this is when it will flow and it gets quite violent, with water going up to halfway up those trees. But for years and years and decades, it can be bone dry. And then the crest of these mountain range, they run in the parallel east-west sort of alignment. It's all uplift, just like what you see around here. So you can imagine the similarities quite exciting with these valleys. And this is where the endemism occurs on the top. Okay, here is some common genera. I've put them in families afterwards because you may not be familiar with a number of the genera. So occasional wattles is the biggest and most dominant, and often forms dominant things, which is surprising because one would normally associate eucalyptus doing that, but not here in the centre. We have, it was in the family Myoporaceae, Eremophila, or the emu bushes. It's quite extensive. Cider, which is common here, another Australian family, Botaniaceae, and then chenopods, now in the hard, tough things, and then good old senna. So some pictures, Goodeniaceae, a Goodenia here, Eremophila, one of the more common species here, and notice it looks a bit like the Texas Ranger desert plant that's been planted around the site here. Good old senna, this is one of the native species, but it actually looks remarkably like one of the taxon that I see by the side of the road here. And then this is a weird cider here. Also looking remarkably like some of the abutilons I've seen around town. And then something that you won't have seen are these two chenopod's, which can be quite important for both the cattle industry. Even though this thing's got birds, it's actually quite nutritious. And these actually form quite extensive communities. The dominant plant families are running Poaceae, Asteraceae, Fabaceae, chenopod's, and Malvaceae. And you can see the numbers, they're quite extensive. But there's some interesting stories hidden amongst in there. When you look at the grasses, look at how large the family is, but then look how small the genera are. There's a lot of genera, and some of them only have 1 or 2 species in amongst that group. So, although the grasses are as common as all hell and are dominantly the ground layer, there actually is very few endemics. The only one being Triodia. All the others are genera that you know and love around the world. The same with the daisies. Look at the number of the number of species, but look at these are the biggest genera. They're really tiny. So there's a number of monotypic genera. These two are in the Asterae tribe, and then the rest of them are in the Nulli or Nephali. So that's the endemic Australian tribe. In the peas, it's even more interesting. We have these smaller tropical groups popping in, except for Swainsona and Cullen, which are 2 Australian endemics. But Swainsona looks like Astragalus, and Cullen was in Soralia. So these are really well-known genera, basically. Visually, when you look at them, they look just like here. But again, we're going to have a lot of genera with very small number of species within them, with these ones only taking up this small number. And then the really interesting stuff is these genera that are important in the Australia makeup that are really low numbers. So Corymbia in the tropics is made up of something like 120 species, but only 17 are in our area. Melaleuca is one of the major, and Grevillea and Acacia, those 3 probably make up around about 15 to 20% of the Australian flora. But look at the tiny figure. Tiny, tiny, tiny things. They radiate and they speciate elsewhere, not with us. And this daisy here, quite a large, one of the largest genera of daisies in the country, probably in the order of about 150 species. We have 7. So this is really, really bizarre for an Australian botanist. They're looking for these genera and they're just not finding them. Here's some pictures. This is a Corymbia of one of the bloodwoods growing on one of the sand dunes. The paperbark there, the Melaleuca, and this is the shrubby daisy that's quite common and is a member of the Asterae. And as I say, if you go into the temperate zone, you will see these things everywhere, on top of mountains, along the coast, radiating, but really small where we are. Now the other cool thing is the absence of really, really common Australian species. Brony and Coria, there are in fact no members of the Rutaceae there at all, yet it's quite a large family. In the Myrtaceae, Leptospermum, really, really important genus of around about 100 species, and we've got zero Banksia. In fact, the territory, my state, only has 1 species out of 150. And no orchids, completely absence of orchids. The old ecologist says this is the best thing that ever happened. We didn't have to deal with amateur conservationists jumping up and down. He's quite happy about that. But really interesting, because orchids are quite large now in the flora around the country, but we have diddly squat. Now the other thing I haven't mentioned here, which is really important here, is the lack of cryptogams. There are almost no lichens and almost no mosses. We have 1 endemic species of moss, and we probably have 3 lichens and 4 mosses. Now if we wander out here, I know that the number is going to be so much bigger. So another bizarre thing, it is just very strange. So, and then finally I have these orphan groups. These groups are part of the Australian autochthonous flora, and we have 1 species that just stick out. When you go driving around and you see these things, you go, oh wow, there's one of those there. You don't actually expect to see them, or if you do, it's one of your highlights. And it's these groups here. So a large monocoque called Xantheria, one of these bearded heaths, which is another common thing in the heathland country. One of the few native pines, we're at the top end of its distribution. Only cycad, which is endemic. A palm, which has got limited distribution. And then there's this daisy-looking Apiaceae. And then the ferns, really cool. We have 31 species out of 101 for the entire state. Really, really tiny numbers. So for an Australian botanist, when they come there, they get out of the car and they go, this looks Australian, but it's not. There's something wrong. As soon as you get out of the car, that's what you say, is you go, I'm home, but I'm not. And what the hell is going on? So it's a really, really good question. Here's some pictures of that cycad, the Palm Valley, and then these grass trees, which are really cool to go and see. It's quite rare in our part of the world. Okay, so I'm seeing three patterns. I'm seeing a temperate, so you've got to remember I'm in the southern hemisphere, so it's coming up from the south. I'm seeing a tropical flora coming down from the north, and then I'm seeing a refugia that is basically stuck into the little tiny crevices of the gorge country. I'm going to deal with the temperate origin. Pretty much in the last 10 million years, we've been drying out, so species have radiated into the arid zone. So often they were quite large, like the Eremophilas and the Sennas and a couple of other groups, the Dicostyluses and the Lamiaceae. They're quite extensive in the arid zone, and as you go back into the temperate, it gets less and less until you end up with just one species. That's quite common with these groups. Some of them retain their temperate traits, so we can have a dreadful drought for 5, 10 years, and the damn thing still flowers in spring. And each year it looks sicker, and each year it looks sicker, because it cannot stop. It still says, it's spring, I must flower, regardless of the conditions. So some of the examples are here. There's an Eremophila, as I mentioned before, a good old Senna in the centre, and a Dicostylis, which is a member of the Lamiaceae. It has been in the Chloanthaceae, and it's also been in another family. The next one is tropical origin, basically 2 to 3 million years ago. It's associated with savanna country. Most of these genera, I pointed out, are pantropical. And here's some examples. A beautiful soybean and good old salamon that I work with in the Martine lab. And then finally we have this refugia. These represent an old period when it was much wetter, so previous to 10 million years. They have these really wide distributions around the countryside and even pantropical, but they're disjunct. So you go to these gorges and you suddenly see wet stuff. Some of them have evolved into new species like the cycad. And here are some of the ferns. So here's a really good example. Here is wet tropics. Here is the top end. And then we have in Central Australia these two sitting in gorges. And there's another gorge here, and there's another gorge here. And then you've got them sitting in Papua New Guinea and in the tropical islands. So in summary, Central Australia is very species rich. The number of things that dominate are the grasses, the peas, the hibiscus family, the wattles. And I think the distribution pattern is based on this three-prong. A temperate approach coming in, a tropical, which is much newer with the crashing into Southeast Asia, and this refugia of very, very old groups that are just hanging on there, and climate change is going to knock them around because they're going to get even smaller. Finally, I want to thank my two locals, Barb Gilfeder, who's one of my volunteers, and my predecessor, David Albrecht, for supplying most of the photos. And I have to thank a big thank you to the Martine Lab. We've been doing work for about 3 or 4 years, and getting in that car and driving around has stimulated this discussion and this talk. Thank you, everyone.